Hi everyone, and welcome to my video for your second theory lesson on food hygiene. What I would recommend is that you listen and concentrate really carefully on what I'm saying in this video because it will help you with the tasks that are coming up after this. So, a wee bit of an introduction then to this lesson. The first term that we've got here in bold is microorganisms. Now, micro means small and organisms means living things. So we're talking about tiny living things such as bacteria and viruses that can cause food poisoning. They are so tiny, in fact, that you cannot see, for example, bacteria or viruses, and you would need a microscope in order to be able to see them. They are so tiny. So, microorganisms like bacteria and viruses occur naturally all around our environment. They occur naturally on food like cereals, vegetables, and fruit. They occur naturally on humans, our bodies, the bodies of animals, in water, in soil, and in the air. So there are microorganisms everywhere, all around us. And the vast majority of these, including bacteria and viruses, are completely harmless to us. But there are a small number of bacteria that can cause illness, including food poisoning. Food which is contaminated with food poisoning microorganisms can look, taste, and smell normal. So, that key word there, contaminated. Contamination is when food contains something that it shouldn't. That could be bacteria. It could be hair that's fallen into the food. It could be a chemical. So there's lots of different ways that food can be contaminated. But if a food is described as contaminated, it means it contains something that it shouldn't, that potentially might cause illness for the person eating it. When food is contaminated with food poisoning bacteria, such as Salmonella or E. coli, you can't always tell that the food has been contaminated. Quite often, the bacteria doesn't change the look, the taste, the texture, or the smell of the food. So it can be really difficult to tell whether food is contaminated or not. And that's why cooking high-risk foods like raw chicken in order to destroy any bacteria is really important. Food poisoning is relatively common and can result from poor food hygiene in the home. The majority of food poisoning cases in the UK happen in the home. They are due to poor food hygiene and poor food preparation routines within the home. It can also occur from eating out. So you could come up against, if you're very unlucky, poor food hygiene in industry. So by industry, I mean different types of food businesses, such as restaurants, cafes, and takeaways. It is less common to get food poisoning from eating out than it is from eating in, but it is still possible if they do not follow the correct food hygiene procedures. The good thing is that restaurants, cafes, and takeaways are regularly checked by the Environmental Health Department to ensure that they are adhering to food hygiene standards. And that's why food poisoning cases from restaurants and takeaways is relatively rare. Contaminants, so things that shouldn't be in the food, such as bacteria, may already be present in the food. For example, salmonella in chicken. So salmonella already exists in raw chicken if it's there. It's not something that's been added to the chicken. So sometimes bacteria is already present in the food. Or sometimes the food is not contaminated with harmful bacteria, but then harmful bacteria is transferred onto that food for some reason. The most common way that harmful bacteria is transferred onto food is through humans. So perhaps humans not washing their hands properly before they start handling the food and transferring bacteria from their hands onto the food. Also, if somebody was to cough or sneeze near food, or they were, for example, to taste food and then put the same spoon back into the food, that would also be transferring bacteria from their mouth into the food. And animals can transfer bacteria onto food as well. So if a fly lands on your food, they can transfer bacteria onto it. And also rodents like mice and rats and other pests can transfer bacteria onto food. So it's really important that we store food correctly, we keep it properly covered in an airtight container or wrapped in cling film and stored in the appropriate place to protect it from being contaminated by bacteria. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is different types of contamination. And there are 4 main types of contamination. The first one is physical contamination. And this is where there is a physical object in the food that should not be there. For example, if you had a glass jar and it chipped and some of that glass got into the food, that would be physical contamination because the glass is a physical object which should not be in the food. If there was anything like stones in the food, which seems relatively unlikely, that would be physical contamination. And also something like a hair, or if a plaster was to fall off somebody's finger while they were preparing food and they didn't notice, a plaster or a hair in the food is a physical object that shouldn't be there. And if you've ever cut yourself in home ec, hopefully not, we provide you with blue plasters if you do need a plaster in home economics. And the reason for that is they are easily visible if they fall into the food. So you wouldn't make the mistake of not noticing if your plaster had fallen into the food. The next type of contamination we're going to look at is allergenic contamination. So we're talking about food allergies here. And this is where a food contains an ingredient or traces of an ingredient that can cause an allergic reaction in some people. And I've got a little example in the picture here, Mars bars and Snickers bars. You probably know that Snickers contain peanuts, but what you might not know is they are often made in the same factory as Mars bars. Because they are made in the same factory, there's always a risk that the Mars bars that don't contain peanuts normally might be contaminated by traces of peanuts from the equipment that's being used, from the staff handling the food. So it's really important that if something like a Mars bar is made in the same factory as a product containing nuts, that will be stated on the label. And if you look at the label on a lot of products, such as a Mars bar, it will say may contain traces of peanuts or may contain nuts. And that's the company covering their back in case there has been any contamination. So it's really important if there is an allergen, something that could cause a food allergy in a product, the manufacturer or the restaurant or cafe that's serving you the food need to tell you that. So for example, the burger restaurant, Five Guys, they fry a lot of their food in peanut oil. Now, obviously, that could cause an allergic reaction in some people. So they state that very, very clearly in all their menus and things. If they didn't state it and somebody with a peanut allergy didn't know, then that would be allergenic contamination. Other examples, so it's not just peanuts, people can be allergic to things like eggs, milk, and sesame seeds. So it's really important that food manufacturers and restaurants give people correct information about any allergens that are in their product to avoid allergenic contamination. We have chemical contamination. This is where the food contains chemicals or traces of chemicals which might be harmful to health. This could be pesticides. So in a lot of farming of fruit and vegetables, the crops will be sprayed with pesticides, and that is to prevent animals and pests from eating the crops. But those pesticides can be harmful to health if we were to consume large doses. So it's really important that when you are preparing fruit and vegetables, that you always give them a good wash. And that helps to remove any pesticide and chemical residues from farming from the surface of your fruit and vegetables. Chemical contamination could also happen with cleaning chemicals. So, for example, if I washed my dishes with washing up liquid, but I didn't rinse out the washing up liquid properly, and then when I added, say, water into my glass, if there was washing up liquid bubbles, that would be an example of chemical contamination because there are traces of that cleaning chemical in my glass that then I might ingest, and that could cause harm. And the last type of contamination is bacterial contamination. And this is where the food is contaminated with harmful microorganisms such as bacteria and viruses. So it could be bacteria such as salmonella. So if, for example, I was to chop up raw chicken, and then I was to chop up salad vegetables on the same chopping board, no hand washing either, I would be transferring that salmonella bacteria from the raw chicken onto the salad leaves, and that is an example of bacterial contamination of the salad leaves. We can also transfer things like viruses and molds as well. Other examples of ways that bacterial contamination might happen, other than kind of cross-contamination and a lack of hand washing, if somebody is to cough or sneeze near food, then they will pass on to the food whatever bacteria or viruses that their body may have at that time.